The world of education is changing.
You kind of need to have an AI specialist in your school.
The world is so much more complicated than it used to be, and so is teaching kids about it.
We're going to move to recommending for all of our new Year 7 cohort that they have what's the so-called dumb phone.
Will Turner is one of the youngest independent school head teachers in the UK.
Don't think there's enough focus on education, and when you look at the problems that we have as a society, a lot of it stems, I think, from the kind of quality of the education system. Even adults don't have the awareness sometimes to know that once you've sent something, if you send a picture of something to someone, it's out there. And it's gone. And you've got no more control over that image.
Stay tuned for all this and more on the Privileged Man podcast.
So, Will, great to have you here on the Privileged Man podcast. Thank you so much for giving us your time tonight.
Yeah, hi, Pete. Yeah, it's really great to be on the podcast. Thanks very much for inviting me.
That was great. Well, this came about from us having a chat at Ryde School where you're the headmaster here on the prestigious Isle of Wight, where we both now live, which is awesome. Take us back a little bit through your journey to being headmaster at Ryde School, if you would, and sort of the schools that you worked at and what you did there.
Yeah, so I studied, well, actually, I guess if I get back to where I went to school, so I went to a boarding school in Cambridge, and I boarded from the age of 15, so for the last 3 years that I was there. So it was a weekly board. I used to go home at weekends. And then I went to university, studied French and Italian, and wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And there were some opportunities to go into teaching that emerged in my final year there. And my parents, who separated when I was younger, who don't speak to each other. I remember my final year at university, I went to stay with my mother around Christmas time, and she said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, I don't know. There's a teaching opportunity, but I fancy going off traveling for a bit. And she said, "Look, you had a gap year. You went traveling then. You've had a 4-year degree, one of which was a year abroad studying. You've got to go out and get a job. I think you should do it." And I thought, well, I don't really like the sound of that, but I passed it off. And then I went to go and stay with my father. And he said, "What are you going to do when you graduate? You've got to have something in mind." And I said, "Well, I don't know. I think we're going off." He said, "You've got to go and get a job. You've had a year out and then you've done this." So, and he said, "Well, there's an opportunity for teaching. I think you should think about it." So I originally, it was a job at Sherborne School in Dorset, which is an all-boys boarding school. And originally it was just as a graduate teacher, sort of teaching about a third of a timetable and doing a lot of sports coaching, being involved in music and drama, which were things that I sort of very much enjoyed my time at school because I was very sporty, but also did a lot of other things like music and drama. And actually then it changed from that point, and the job actually became the opportunity to start as a PGCE teacher there and then, and living in the school and everything else. And originally I sort of did it thinking I might just do it for a year and see what happens. But then just grew to really love it. So I started there, working in the modern languages department. And then from there I moved to Ryde School, where I lived in one of the boarding houses as an assistant housemaster, and then became head of modern languages. And then I moved to St John's School, Leatherhead, where I was deputy head academic. And then after that, I moved to UWC Adriatics as part of the United World Colleges, which are 18 schools and colleges around the world. They're very different to British boarding schools or British independent schools. And I was head there before moving to the Isle of Wight 2 years ago. So a bit of a change to where I am now, but a variety of different schools. All of them have been independent schools. The school I was head of in Italy was quite different because 75% of the students there were on full scholarships, 10% were on partial scholarships. Many of the students there were from refugee backgrounds as well. And so it was quite different to what I had experienced in UK schools. And I deliberately wanted to find something a bit different for my own development as an educator. And yeah, so here I am now.
Wow. All before the ripe old age of?
Yeah, so I'll be 40 next year. So it's been a busy time in that. Wow. So I'll be 40 next year. Yeah.
Some might say a slight overachiever, Will.
Well, I don't know. That's for you to say, Pete. And I think, I mean, I never sort of started out thinking, right, I want to become a head by a certain age, or I want to do a certain job by a certain age. I just, opportunities came up. I applied for them, and people that were making the appointments felt I was the right fit, and I've worked really hard in the jobs that I've had and tried to do the best I can. And I think a lot of it comes from a real passion for working in schools with young people and wanting to sort of deliver the best I can for the school I'm working in with the people I'm working with. So yeah,
awesome.
It's been a busy time.
Yeah, sounds like it. And if I just go back slightly, you mentioned your parents splitting up when you were younger. Was boarding school, as a result, a bit of a release from that tension?
Yeah, so actually it was actually. My parents separated at the end of my GCSE year. So I boarded for that year, and I actually remember asking to become a boarder because it was a difficult time at home. And I really wanted to escape that. It was difficult. Later on, I found that my parents had actually decided that they were going to separate about a year and a half before they actually separated, and they wanted to wait for me to finish my GCSEs before they separated, because they felt that would be less disruptive. I mean, actually then disrupted me quite a lot for my sixth form, emotionally. But for me, actually, and I see this as a real benefit for boarding, is that it created a lot of structure and support around me. Not that I didn't have support from my parents, I certainly did. But it was a difficult separation. It was quite acrimonious. And it was quite a hard time for me and my sister in different ways, who's a couple of years younger than me. And we're both at the same school at the same time. But yeah, for me, it definitely was a real help in giving me that structure and support. And the ability to spend time doing things that I really enjoyed doing, and all the sport, music and drama and the subjects that I really enjoyed, as well as just spending time with people you really get on with. And I think like my closest friends now are all people I went to school with, and some of whom I've known since I was 7. But they're people that I then lived with in a boarding house. Not all of them are in the same house as me, but a lot of them I went to school together. And there's a big group of us who are still very, very close friends many years on.
With that experience in mind, do you have a special kind of empathy for boys and girls you see going through family issues?
Yeah, I really do, actually. Without sort of giving too much away, there are some cases that in my career, certainly in the time I've been a head and a deputy, that I definitely really feel I've been able to empathise with children who are struggling, and sometimes that can manifest itself in different ways. And I think it's quite easy for teachers to say, "Oh, this child's disruptive, or they're difficult, or it's I'm not getting the best out of them." But children aren't born disruptive or difficult. That that often is certain emotions underneath that are manifesting themselves in a certain way, and it's really about trying to unlock that support. I think what helps massively now is that people are much more open to therapy for young children and for teenagers in particular. Not so much, really young children, but often with teenagers. And sometimes having counselling of different sorts can really help unpick some of those emotional challenges that teenagers can find themselves in. And when you throw in the challenges of adolescence as well, I think I really can empathise because I've faced those challenges myself. And that was at a time though when there wasn't much openness to counselling, and although my mother suggested it to me at the time, I didn't take her up on it. But then I actually she didn't offer it to me, but suggested I might consider it. I
was going to say, what would you say was, if you look back at how you wish it was dealt with? How would it be dealt with now? What would be? I mean, there's
I think now, and I felt well supported by the teachers I had at school, and they really took time to kind of support me. And I think that there was quite close communication with my mother in particular about how I was doing, and there was a bit of a sort of triangulation around that. But in hindsight, I think it would have been hugely helpful to have had some counselling at the time. I later had I've had different stages of my life, had different counselling at different points to talk through different things that I've felt I've been dealing with in that time of my life. But particularly some of the counselling I had in my 20s, I felt really helped me reflect on those years effectively. But I think if I'd had it at the time, it would have helped me through my university years where there was a bit of a sort of dark cloud lingering on from that. So yeah, it was that I found very helpful, and I think if I were in that situation now as a head, or when in my teaching career, I've often suggested that to families and parents, not only from my own experience but also from looking at other children that I've seen in my career and seeing how much even just 3 or 4 sessions with a counsellor can have, and the impact on that. And then it really opens up the ability for that child to talk to their parents, and for their parents to sort of understand the journey that child's on, to the benefit of everybody in that family unit. Whether it's a separation, divorce, whether it's grief, whether, whatever it is, there can be a traumatic incident that a child can face in their younger years. There can be a whole host of things, and giving that level of support is really important, I think.
Yeah. It's very interesting. You talk about support. You talked about the fact that you're a weekly boarder. I think way back when, I think I would have been about 3 years above you. The school that I went to, and I think many people went to during the sort of 90s, wasn't necessarily weekly, and there was it was full boarding. Recognizing that that's one of the differences between now and then, what other differences do you see in boarding schools, or maybe you want to even bring Ryde into this?
Yeah,
between now and then.
Sure. I mean, I think it's hard for me to kind of comment some before the 90s. I went to school at a similar time to you, Pete, and so it joined in the late 90s and finished in the early 2000s. And you read and hear about what boarding schools were like in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and I think schools have moved an enormous way on from what they were like then. And speak to people probably of our parents' generation, if they went to that sort of school, they'll talk about cold showers and inedible food and things like that. I mean, I think even when I was at school, the food was okay, but it wasn't, I don't know what it was like where you, I mean, it was fine, but I didn't sort of think, nowadays you go into a school, the food is really great. Right. And there's a huge range of choices, and it's very healthy. I remember when I was at school, there was fried bread every breakfast if you wanted it, which I went for every day.
And baked beans.
Yeah, and baked beans. So the staple breakfast was fried bread, baked beans, and then one other item, whether it was a sausage or a rasher of bacon or an egg or something.
Get your proteins in, obviously.
Get your proteins in, yeah. And I absolutely loved it. The thought of having that every day now, I just don't know how I could do that. But it was, I mean, I think that the big sort of changes, one of it is just around how nice the environment is. And it is a very comfortable environment. Boarding houses, the rooms are comfortable. Some of them are, very old buildings, and schools can be a bit limited with the spaces that they have if they've got, centuries old boarding houses that were built in the Victorian era. We're quite lucky here at Ryde in that the school actually invested quite a lot of money in new boarding facilities a few years ago, and we actually have co-ed boarding, so we have boys and girls together, and we separate our boarding by age rather than by gender. And so we have our boarders in the ones that would be in years 9 and 10, so they'd be sort of 13, 14, 15, and we do have some that's slightly younger than that sometimes, but in a junior house, and then we have a senior house which is 15 to 18 year olds, and then the boys and girls have separate sleeping areas which are locked down at night, and then they have common areas that they share and so on, and that's a kind of more modern approach, but those facilities are very comfortable. They've got lots of kitchen spaces. They've got a lot of social spaces. There's staff, living within all of that as well. So on that level, there's been a significant change in terms of what it feels like to live in those environments. And I think that in boarding schools 40, 50 years ago, it wasn't necessarily a very comfortable environment. A lot of schools have moved away from the big dormitories as well. And those have been broken up into little rooms where you might have 3 or 4 maximum sleeping together in a room. There's a lot of research to show actually if you have larger groups sleeping together that it's not conducive to great sleep and various other things which are really important. I don't know what it's like when you were at school and if you were in a big dormitory, and there probably all sorts used to happen, and I don't know.
Struggle to get back there, but it's I think we were in a 16 to start with. I think one of the things that I can just highlight straight off you saying that is the sort of maturity around the child that must be more developed. than when I was, 15, 16, 17. Because, we weren't even trusted to go and be on the girls' side of the house. In fact, it was a suspendable offence. So to come through, without permission, to come through with actually like living together, it's treating, there's more respect there, isn't there?
I think so, definitely. But I think here, the school that I worked at in Italy also had mixed boarding. But in the other schools I worked in, it was boys' houses, and the first two schools were all boys' schools, so they were all boys' houses. But in when I was at St John's, it was mixed boys and girls, and in separate houses. Sorry. So I think when you have that set up, the concept as a boy or as a girl going to a boy's house or a girl's house, which is the opposite sex to you, is quite, this is taboo. And it does create a bit of I'm in the boy's house or I'm in the girl's house kind of feeling. But I think schools work quite hard to kind of break that down. But certainly for us in a co-ed boarding environment, the pupils here don't know any different. And actually for them, it's very normal because that is also a normal family setup. To be mixed boys and girls, everyone together. And it works very well. But the other big sort of changes I see is just the kind of level of pastoral care and support and wellbeing support that's in place in pupils and for the pupils. So there's wellbeing centres. You have directors of wellbeing and pastoral care in schools. You have some schools have trained psychologists who are working in the school. You have where we have our director of wellbeing is a coach, a trained sort of coach, and she also can train our staff to be coaches. And we have staff who are trained as coaches so that they can support the pupils effectively, recognizing that we're not mental health experts or psychologists. And it's important, I think, for educators and teachers to know that they can't become a kind of pseudo psychologist, but it's how can you best support a child in front of you. I think it's very easy as an adult just to tell a child what to do, but that's not empowering the child. It's not giving them the opportunity to learn from themselves. And coaching helps people become very reflective listeners, as well as guiding young pupils through any challenges that they're facing. But it then also creates an environment in which they feel more happy to talk about what they're facing. And I know that's a lot of the work that you focus on is that historically there hasn't been that culture. It's not a very British thing either. What I found amazing in my last school, where there were 80 different nationalities, is the cultural difference in how people would or wouldn't talk about themselves and their emotions. And there were some nationalities who it was just a brick wall and you had to kind of break down that brick wall to get them to open up about certain things. And then there were other nationalities who would march in your office and just pour out everything that they thought and were very emotional, but they therefore really understood themselves. So there's a lot of support that goes on with that, which I think has been a significant change, and the training that then has gone alongside that for boarding staff, so that they feel well equipped for it. When you and I were at school, you were kind of at the luck of the draw of your housemaster and the staff that were in the house and your tutor or whoever that might be, and how they, how effective they were at supporting you or not. And that was just their character and their personality. And you were at the luck of that. I don't think they had any training. But it's also important to bear in mind, though, that Ofsted didn't come about until the major government in 1993. And then the Independent Schools Inspectorate, which is the body that inspects boarding schools by and large, came about in the late 90s. So when you and I were at school, that was only just starting out. And having been an ISI inspector earlier on in my career, the scrutiny that takes place in the school, so much of it is actually focused on the compliance element of it and the fact that they have proper safeguarding and supportive measures in place. Yes, some of it's on the quality of the education, but actually there's a significant percentage of it is actually on what's going on to support the children and the environment that they're studying in and learning in. So that's quite a seismic shift, really, even in just a generation from when you and I were at school, because actually I think the difference between what you and I would have been different to, say, our parents' generation, but I think children who are in schools now, it's a very different place. And I see environments really where where pupils and young people can be themselves. I think that I never felt at school that I had to be. I felt I could be myself. I didn't feel like I was trying to put on a persona or anything like that. Although I know, Nick Duffel will say that there are certain categories that he feels come out from a boarding school environment, or certainly in the research he did in the time, 80s and 90s. I don't necessarily think that I see that nowadays. I think that schools in general, and that's not just boarding schools, but they are much more welcoming places for people to be who they want to be. Not to say that's the case in every school across the UK. There will always be moments when young people are unkind to each other, because to make mistakes is to be human. And, young people make more mistakes than when you get older, but even adults make mistakes, and, we continue to make them as our life goes on. And life is really a series of mistakes and how you learn from them in lots of ways. And, but I do think that schools are environments now in which young people can say, well, this is who I am, whether it's to do with their identity, whatever that might be. There's a lot more acceptance of people being who they want to be.
Yeah, very, very interesting, and thank you for that answer. I think it's just, there's so much in there to unpack, and I'm going to just go on one word that you said, which is safeguarding. Yeah, and the word for me is safe, because I speak to, as you might expect, thousands of men by now about their experience of schooling, and how, and I'm speaking to mostly men in their late 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s, and who are opening up to me, but maybe for the first time, that they feel safe in somebody's, maybe mine, maybe the group's, maybe, with a partner that they're maybe on their second or third partner by the time they actually feel safe. And this is because they were so unsafe as children. The environment, and this saying comes up, environment dictates performance, right? And this environment that they were in these very shady establishments, whether it was private or public, to be honest, in the 70s, 80s, and quite a long way through the 90s as well. My question comes down to safety. What is a safe age, in your opinion, that children could or should start boarding?
Where I am at Ryde, we take boarders from age 11, but we have a quarter of our places are for that 11 to 15, and then 3/4 of our places are for 15 to 18, and that reflects the kind of market with it. But from a safety point of view, I feel that with what's in place and what I have seen in my career, all of these boarding schools are safe environments. If they follow if you've got the right staff and you're following what's expected of you, and you're following things to the high standards that are in place in boarding schools nowadays, I think they're all safe environments for children to be in. I mean, I think that's ultimately for parents to choose, for them to make their decision over that. If you look at the statistics, I think there's in the ISC, so the Independent Schools Council, which has the data for most boarding schools in the UK, I think junior boarding is only 2% of pupils in that junior age range that are boarders. So, it's not something that many parents are choosing. And then even when you go into senior school, I think it's about 12%. I think are boarders in the senior school, and then that goes up to about 1 in 3 in the sixth form age. So you can see from that trend that actually it becomes much more of something that people look at when children move to sixth form age, 15, 16, 17, 18. And I think some of it is also parents saying, well, what do I feel comfortable with my child? Some of it's also family arrangements. So forces families, for example, if parents work in the forces and they can be stationed anywhere in the world for any period of time and moved around and so on, the reason that their children will go into a boarding school is to provide continuity for their education and consistency and so on. So it's something that's really for parents to choose.
But when I say safe, I mean emotionally safe.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a psychologist or a psychoanalyst, and obviously Nick Duffel and Joy Shavarian, who've been on your podcast earlier, will have their views on it. And I don't have any first-hand experience of boarders under the age of 11 in my professional career, so I can't really comment on that age range. But what I see nowadays also, which is a big change from when you and I were probably at school, or people from that were in school before the 90s, is the huge level of contact with parents and with families. And it's never been easier just to have a quick call, a video call, whatever, with parents and with relatives, with siblings. And I think there's a far greater involvement of parents, even if their child's at a boarding school. It's not like it was back in the day where parents dropped off a child in September. They wrote a letter home on a Sunday that was probably censored by the school, and they saw them at half term, or it's an exeat weekend or something like that. Exeat weekend, for people listening, if they're not sure, that's a weekend where boarders can go home. And there was very limited contact. That's not what boarders' existence is now. They'll be talking to them every night, and they're having that contact with parents every day. So it's quite a different existence in that regard. And then there's also regular communication with boarding staff and parents. If the boarding staff feel they're a bit worried about something, they'll let parents know. Parents are worried about something, they might let them know and just say, "What have you picked up anything from your perspective?" And there's a bit of triangulation that goes on around the child to ensure that they're supported as best as possible.
Thank you. I mean, you bring up some really interesting points there. I mean, including like a massive shift, of course, is the phones.
Yeah.
I've been really, really, really knuckling into this one lately.
Yeah.
I'm 42 years old. I'm running my own businesses, and there's a marketing need, if you like, to what I put out, I get back. So there's like an exchange, there's a return on my phone investment.
Yeah.
When it comes to children, I've been listening to a guy called Jonathan Hyde, who's out of the States, and he's just written a book called The Anxious Generation. Yeah. Right. It's becoming, I think, quite well known. Yeah. His take on it, there are 3 takes, and I think there are 4, but I'll go with the first 3, is the first of all, that smartphones should be banned in schools.
Yeah.
Second one is that you should have no social media before 16. And the third one is to have actually no smartphone before you're 14, on the basis that you cannot police what children see on smartphones. It's just not possible. Yes, there are, there are various different apps that can help and all the rest of it. Where do you sit on that?
I completely agree with him. Right. I completely agree with him. And I would love it if the government would show a little bit more backbone with this and would actually say these things are really harming children. We have a policy at Ryde where children hand their phones in up to year 11, so up to the age of 16 in the morning. When they come into school, they put them in a little locker and they can only collect them at the end of the day. And when they're in the sixth form, they're allowed phones, but they can only get them out in certain areas of the school. They can't walk around looking at them. I think it's frightening when you read some of the statistics about how many hours young children are spending on devices, but I think this unregulated access to the internet that they can have. And I think, you can put apps on that can control this, that, and the other and restrict use and so on. But it does really require a tech savvy parent to do that. And even then, when I speak to parents who work in the tech world, they say it's also really easy just to get around that. And your smart kid will be like, yeah, okay, thanks, mum, thanks, dad. Yeah. And off they go. What I sometimes use as a sort of analogy to this is, you and I would have grown up in, the videotape generation. We didn't have DVDs, we had videos, and you had places like Blockbuster or your video rental store, and you'd have the 18 certificates at the top, and then you got your 15s and your 12s and so on. And I remember very strongly when I speak to people of similar generation or older, that the idea of watching a 15 when you were 14 was quite edgy. And like the idea of watching an 18, and I had a cousin who actually showed me Predator, the film. Do you remember the film Predator with Arnold Schwarzenegger?
Of course.
When I was far too young to see it, and it scared the living daylights out of me. And I don't think I slept for about 2 months because I just thought Predator was going to come in and shoot me or whatever. And although that content is quite different to what you might see on a mobile device now, the way I liken it is that it was a real kind of tier to move up to what is very adult content. And I remember watching my first 18 movies. I can't remember what they are, but seeing either sexual content or really quite horrific violence or some really abusive scenes or something like that, thinking, oh, that's pretty serious stuff. And being quite, I can see why this is an 18. And the problem now with a mobile device is that parents will often think, oh, WhatsApp, it's just a messaging service. But all it takes is an older sibling to send something pornographic or something visually, horrific or whatever, that then, a 17-year-old brother sends to his 14-year-old brother, hey, look at this. And the 14-year-old then just sends it around a whole year group WhatsApp. And within 2 clicks, you've got maybe 60 14-year-olds that have seen some pornography. They can't unsee that. They can't turn back those 3 seconds. And then you create an environment where that child might then think, I don't want to talk to my parents about this because I'm a bit ashamed about it. Or you do get some kids who then say, this is what I've seen. So you end up in a very difficult situation. And then the more kind of proactive parents will say, right, will really lock it down with their child and say, you're not having this, you're not having that. But then kids will say to the parents, I'm the only one in the year group who doesn't have this, or, why are you doing this to me? And the parents end up being sort of made the bad guy. So actually what we're doing as a school is we're changing our approach from September. And I'm going to say this to parents next week, but I think this podcast will air after that, so I don't think it's too much of a scoop. But it's Pete, you're going to get the scoop in a few miles down the road in the Isle of Wight. Is that we're going to move to recommending for all of our new Year 7 cohort that are coming into our senior school and pupils below that they have what's the so-called dumb phone. Now, I don't like the term dumb phone. I think it gives it a negative context, and I prefer basic phone or simple phone. But a phone that doesn't have internet access, that can only make text and calls. Because I recognise also we have kids who get the bus and things like that. They want to be able to let the parents know if they're running late, or can you pick me up from here and whatever. And I think we live in a world where children need to be able to communicate. But I just don't see the benefits of this. And in schools, so much of what we deal with in terms of friendship group fallouts or unkind behavior from one child to another stems in what goes on a mobile phone far more than what is an actual human face-to-face interaction. And I think as a school, I mean, it was done before I joined here, but we've rolled it out up to year 11, the idea of phones not being brought in. And what I really like is when we walk around at break times or whatever, you just see kids talking to each other, playing football on the fields or on the pitches, or, like things I think young people should be doing rather than looking at a screen and so on. And that's not to say that technology doesn't have its benefits, because technology is amazing. There's so many great things that technology can give us, things that we can do with it, all at the click of a button. But
when our brains are developed, right?
Yeah, hugely so. And I think that even adults don't have the awareness sometimes to know that once you've sent something, if you send a picture of something to someone, it's out there, and it's gone, and you've got no more control over that image, whatever it might be, or that text, and a screenshot of this or that. And the various things that have come out from the COVID inquiries of the Boris Johnson government and all the WhatsApp chats and everything else, left, right, centre, you don't have any control over that. And I think that it just can be really, really dangerous for young people, and the impulsivity that they have and immaturity, which is not a criticism, because when you're 11, 12, 13, 14, you are immature in different ways, and you're mature in other ways, but you don't understand the potential dangers of that unregulated access. And my hope is that we're at the sort of we're not at the crest of a wave, but there's this wave building in societies around the world where we start to turn around and say, actually, this isn't a good thing. And we start to move away from it. Now, we're introducing that for our year 7s and below from September. It's not a rule, it's a strong recommendation, because I can't, it's not my responsibility to control what a parent buys for their child. I'm the headmaster of a school. I can't tell them what they eat at home or what devices they have. But what I can say is that our strong recommendation is that your child has this device, and that even when they bring it into school, they won't have access with it. It'll still be in a locker. And we will run with that for next year, and it will run on into year 8. And then we will make an assessment of how effective that is and see where we go from there.
It's all good stuff, Will. It's all good stuff. I'd really like to hear that. And a question. You don't have the power to tell the adults, maybe I'm hearing this wrong.
Yeah.
That their children can't bring a smartphone into school.
I mean, I have the power to say they can't bring a smartphone into school.
Yeah.
But I don't have the power to say you can't buy them a smartphone.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, I could certainly have that, but I think that, when they're bringing a device in and they're putting it in their locker, we've got 570 kids in our senior school. I don't think we can't monitor every device. Is this a smartphone or not, or whatever? But I think if we make it clear that it's a strong recommendation, that this is what they do, and if parents all buy into that, then the whole generation, that whole year group benefits from parents buying into it. But I can't force them to do that. And I'm not trying to force parents to do something, but I'm making it a strong recommendation and saying, if you buy into that, then I think it's going to really benefit your child, and their development are what are kind of quite pivotal parts of their development into their mid-teens and then adulthood.
Sure. There's this movement, isn't there? SFC, smartphone free childhood.
Yeah.
It's, I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but
I'm aware of it. Yeah.
Seems to be massively picking up momentum. Yeah. Sways of schools seem to be jumping on this. Yeah. It all comes, as Jonathan Hyde says, it all comes from the parents. Like, the government's, as you say, a limp about this. They've got the big tech companies are paying some of the taxes. Maybe not as much as they should be, but they are paying some taxes, and they seem to have globally power over the educational over the education standards of children, which is completely nuts. Yeah. When we all know, as parents and as teachers, that the benefits are definitely not outweighing these chronic and sometimes fatal consequences of cyberbullying. So look, I'm very lucky. I get to live on this beautiful island, and I get to work on I get to work from home and see my kids, and I'm an absolute beneficiary of technology. But I think it's robbing children of their childhood, and therefore the way in which they can trust and learn to fail without being shamed.
Yeah. I feel that adolescence is a challenging enough time. And things can happen at school that as an adolescent you find embarrassing, for silly reasons, that in a rational thought process, you'd say, well, you don't need to be embarrassed by that. But a child can't help the way they feel about something. And there are more insecurities when you're an adolescent than when you get older in many cases. And you can't sometimes then escape that. If there's a funny photograph taken of you, or a photograph taken of you where you don't like the way you look, that then circulated on a group or on Snapchat or TikTok or WhatsApp or anything like that, a child then goes home and they kind of relive that embarrassment, or it goes on. And it's not, we would have all faced when we were at school a moment you think, oh, that was really embarrassing. But it's just the 4 people that were there who saw it, and maybe they went and told someone else and said, oh, Turner did this, or Hunt did that, or whatever. And a couple of people give you, have a bit of a laugh about it. But by the day after, it's completely forgotten. And you kind of move on, and that happens in childhood, and that happens in adolescence, it happens in adulthood. Embarrassing things happen, and people might mock you or whatever. And some people can deal with that, some people can't. Some people do it in a good-hearted, natured way, and some people don't. But technology means that you can keep reliving those things. And for me, the biggest thing with social media is the fact that the word user is the one that is referred to with people that use social media. And the only other thing I can think of that we use the word user for is drugs. So,
mic drop moment.
Yeah, but it talks about, that tells you all you need to know about the addictivity of it. And I got rid of my social media a long time ago. I have WhatsApp because it's a communication device, and I'm on groups with friends and family. And if I didn't do that, then I wouldn't be in contact with them. But I don't regret that. Change 1 minute.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, you and many other teachers, right? I mean,
there's also a professional thing. You can't have your life on the screen. But I moved away from it well before I was in a senior management position, because I just felt I was spending too much time on it, and I was just doom scrolling, as people call it. I just sat there and thought, what am I doing?
And you're an intelligent adult, right? I mean, how are we supposed to honestly be protecting our children, from this when they're not even conscious of it? So I want to just pick up on something you just said. You said senior management role. Yeah. Interestingly, that that sort of has business perception to it.
Yeah.
Looking at independent schools, looking at education, really, but looking at your role as the CEO, if you like, of Ryde School, and seeing the influx of AI, the tidal wave, the tsunami, whatever you want to call it, it is coming, and it's coming really fast.
Yeah.
What does the education system look like to you in the next 5-10 years, and how are you going to adapt?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a rapid change, and I think there'll be things that there'll be unknowns with it. People don't even know what it's going to bring and what it's going to deliver. I think that it has the real potential to make teachers' lives easier. But what is tricky is you kind of need to have an AI specialist in your school to understand how to harness it, or you need to have companies that develop ways in which AI is used really effectively in schools. And I think that, for example, if a number of schools now already use AI to respond to sort of FAQs that parents might ask, whether parents are joining, and it reads all the kind of commonly asked questions and data, and you build up a bank of data so parents can just type in their question, ping, an answer comes back, or they read through all the pupil handbooks or whatever else you've got in terms of the paperwork that accompanies the school, and it just gives the information back, rather than a prospective parent emailing someone in the admin team of a school or the admissions department saying, what uniform is needed for this, or what time do lessons begin, or all these sorts of things that new parents want to make sure they know for their child. That those hours are saved, and that's a sort of mundane, day-to-day sort of thing that might happen. But then I think there'll be loads of stuff that comes out in terms of how it can help with teaching. I don't think we'll ever be in a world where we don't have people in front of classes, because learning is such a human interaction. And to the idea of a child sitting in front of a screen all day, we saw in lockdowns when children do that, and well, not just children, but adults were working online all day. It just frazzled us, didn't it? And it's not a healthy thing to be doing, just looking at screens all day. But I can certainly see a fast development in what would be called diagnostic programs on a computer. So, if you're doing some maths questions, and a lot of this exists already, but that you're answering your questions and then it comes back with another question that's harder. And if you don't get that right, then it comes back to another question to make sure you then get it and you move on. But it's your learning experience doing those exercises rather than when you and I are at school, it's right, let's turn to page 63, exercise 1, just do the odd ones actually. And then exercise 2, you can do the even ones. And then exercise 6, don't do the last question because it's incorrect or something like that. And you just trundle through them. And some of them, either you breeze through them because you get it all and therefore you're just doing the same thing again and again. But this diagnostic element would allow people to be challenged further and further. And for some subjects that will work, but not for others. So I can see that coming in a bit more. But yeah, I'm not an expert. I try to learn more and more about it. When I go to different meetings and conferences, there's always people talking about it and the way it's going to progress. So we'll see. But I think, I can see AI being a huge thing in medical care as well. The ability to sort of talk to a robot about your symptoms, and then a judgment is kind of made, what you then need to do. And does that then refer you to a pharmacist because actually you just need to go and get this medicine, or do you then you're then referred to an actual doctor who sees you? There's a whole host of things which I think will address many of the, if you look at the healthcare in this country and documented waiting lists and all that sort of stuff, there are certain ways in which I think those can be addressed by using technology.
Yeah, no one's talking about it, but that's a completely different.
No, but well, we're just on the Isle of Wight, Pete. We can't solve the bigger islands' problems north of us. So,
well, that's quite right. Well, we've got it absolutely nailed here, haven't we?
Yeah.
Just rounding things off, do you, you just talked about a little bit about sort of the more generic or wider educational problems, if you like. When you go to conferences and you meet with other heads, can you give me the top 3 brief challenges that are topical at the moment?
Well, in independent schools at the moment, the top 3 are VAT on fees, VAT on fees, and VAT on fees, as you can imagine. And it'll be interesting to see where that goes forward. And we see where we get to with that. I understand the sentiments behind that as a policy, and the sentiments behind trying to raise money for education more broadly. But I'm not convinced that the consequences of that policy being brought in one fell swoop have been thought through. And I think that the consequences of that could be quite significant to children, and quite significant to employees of schools and various other people that are connected to schools and so on. So that is a big one at the moment. But I think looking more as an educationalist, I think from a British point of view, I think there's a lot of frustration at the GCSE system and the curriculum. And from my perspective, the most significant curriculum review that we had was when Michael Gove was Education Secretary. And really that just involved Michael Gove saying GCSEs and A-levels are too easy now, there's grade inflation, we need to go back to them what they were like in my day. And I think that was a really... there were certain elements of that were beneficial, and there were certain things that have happened in terms of education in since then that have been beneficial, and there has been an impact. And if you look at younger ages, the introduction of phonics has really helped spelling, and the introduction of national curriculum has certainly helped in certain regards. But the GCSEs, there are hardly any countries in the world that examine children at 16. We're quite alone really in that in Britain in terms of doing that. And it's just this sort of factory of an experience, really, and the amount of content that children have to learn and get through. And yes, there is an assessment of skills and so on, but moving away from coursework elements and so on to a terminal exam at the end of 2 years, old school people will say, well, that separates the wheat from the chaff, what you can learn over 2 years, and then churn out that separates the brightest from those that aren't so bright, or those that are more able than those that are less able. But the world isn't all about knowledge now. When I can tap on my computer right here and find something out. Now, I was a child who loved knowledge. I loved reading trivia books and learning things and learning facts. And I think that it is a really good thing to still maintain knowledge and learn it. But I'm not convinced that a GCSE curriculum of 8, 9, 10 subjects, just having to regurgitate a lot of information that you've all learned, reflects what people are then going to go into in terms of the modern world. Universities are moving towards a lot more open book assessments, less time restricted assessments, and so on. So I would really like the government to look at this, and I don't think there's enough focus on education. And when you look at the problems that we have as a society, a lot of it stems, I think, from the kind of quality of the education system. And what we're asking people to do is, are they developing skills that are then really going to be useful in a modern workplace? I'm not sure they are, and therefore it's up to the school to then create a curriculum outside of the the co-curriculum or extracurriculum or whatever you want to call it, the experiences outside the classroom, to try and then develop the skills that they think people are going to need in the future. And certainly that's what we do at my school. But we are fortunate, being a private school, an independent school, that we have more resources to do that, because we charge fees and so on. And my colleagues who work in the maintained sector, they get about £7,500 per child per year, and the average day school will get £18,000 per year per child. So the difference in that is quite significant in terms of what you can offer. And so I think that if you can create a curriculum that focuses more on that, then that will really help. But what is a challenge is that people don't like change. Teachers generally don't like change. And what I'm talking about is a kind of really big shift in terms of what that curriculum looks like, and how it's assessed, and so on. And I would much prefer a more staggered assessment process over a period of time, where you don't suddenly have to learn for 10 subjects and you're being examined in all 10 at one time, but actually let's say, right, well, we're working towards something in these subjects, in the same way that when you're in the world of work, you've got projects, where you've got group things that you do and so on, and that you've got presentations that you deliver, and the way in which that's assessed, I'd really like to see done differently.
Yeah, brilliantly put, especially from someone who's dyslexic and learning more about this neurodiverse spectrum that is so now broad. I can think back to the way I was treated, taking exams, and think how much of a huge impact that had on me, not just in the 2 or 3 hours, maybe 4 hours that I was given to do the same amount of work, but it was the before, the anxiety effect before it too, that I was up against these super bright kids, and being tested on that same level, being by default being put at the bottom of the pile, when actually I was probably one of the brightest kids there, but just not academically bright.
Yeah, and the system didn't help you sort of show your talents. But I also think it's the same with A levels. The idea of just studying 3 subjects for 2 years in great depth. If you struggle academically, or struggle in the A level framework, you're putting all your eggs in 3 baskets. And if 2 of those baskets don't work so well, then you can kind of bomb out quite easily in 2 subjects. And that can end up leading to quite a deflated child at 18 going into the world, having found A levels a real struggle. And that's why I prefer the more baccalaureate type approach. And where I am, we do the international baccalaureate, we do the diploma program and the careers related program, because they offer different programs that are better suited to the individual. And there are some individuals who love A levels and that works really well for them. But I feel that as the kind of standard approach, and I know that there is some talk from political parties about the way that they would do this differently, but I think that there's still the importance to have that depth of study in certain areas and certain sort of specialisms that you then might move on to at university. But I also think the breadth of study and maintaining or continuing the study of certain disciplines further up to 18, I think is really beneficial in a child's development and the learning of an adolescent and everything they're going to develop skills-wise as well as knowledge before going into the world, wherever that may take them.
Yeah, I love that. Love that. It's feels very aligned for me as an individual and what I'd love to see happen in the education system, especially moving forward with everything, as you rightly talk about how knowledge is just in the phone. So what are the skills that children really need? So I think that brings me nicely to my last question, Will, which you may have just answered, but if you were, let's say, Education Secretary tomorrow, what would you do?
Well, I mean, I would like to see a really big curriculum review, but a curriculum review that's sort of taking into account the 2 to 18 age range, but then even looking at what's going on at university and what people are studying there and how that's working. Because I just think the greatest impact that any government can have on a society is the quality of the education system that's in place. Now, I get that funding and resources is a big challenge in all of this. But if you have a curriculum that is going to really well prepare children for the world of work, for a huge range of professions, and that particularly maybe when you get to sort of 16 plus, there are different routes that you can follow, but the way in which it's assessed and what you have to learn and the sort of assessment framework in particular, that focuses on the development of skills alongside harnessing some knowledge, so that you have people that have a really good skill set going into the world of work, whatever that might be. Even if it's people developing, really sort of artisanal skills to go in and work in woodwork or something like that. I appreciate that there are things that machines can do, but there's still a lot of stuff that human beings need to do by hand, and the ability to harness those skills, be they creative, scientific, whatever, that there are those pathways that people can follow, because I just think that the whole country will benefit from having a stronger curricular offering that's going to serve the country well in the future. And I think that will then trickle down and so on. But what that requires, which is something that rarely happens in this country, is kind of continuity in the policy and the approach to education from successive governments. And we live in a world where political parties are worried more about the election result and their core base or their voter base that they think is going to attract the votes, than saying this is the right thing to do for the country. And what I would really like all parties to look at in terms of education is to say, we need to have a cross-party agreement of a 15 to 20 year education strategy. Of this is what we want to take the country on in terms of a journey, and that all parties buy into that. And it almost sits aside from any politics, because it's about, well, what does the country need? What's going to benefit the country? How are we going to do it? And this is what we're going to commit to. And then you have that continuity, because otherwise what you have is a government comes in, it's either a priority or it's not. And then you have a wave of change, and then another government comes in and says, we don't like that. And then teachers get very frustrated, because we sit here and we say, well, where do we stand with this? We've got this new curriculum, it's going to change, and then in a few years' time, another government will come in and change it again, and whatever. And I think that there are certain things in society, and education is one of them, that I'd really like to see just a proper long-term strategy from the government with it.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Great way to end. Thank you so much for all your insights, Will. It's been fascinating.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much, Pete.
So thank you for joining me, Pete Hunt, on the Privileged Man podcast. If you're interested in learning more about our personal and professional development platform for men in their professional prime, please visit the website monumental.global for more details.